The tropical sun hangs heavy and blood-red over the Philippine Sea, casting elongated, distorted shadows of silver giants across the coral-packed runways. This is not the clean, clinical war of high-altitude charts and oxygen masks. On the tarmac, 334 Boeing B-29 Superfortresses, the most expensive machines ever built, groan under the weight of a new kind of terror. Mechanics, slick with sweat and grease, make final adjustments to the right R-3350 engines. Each cylinder head radiates a shimmering heat that blurs the horizon. Inside the cavernous bomb bays, there are no high-explosive blockbusters. Instead, there are thousands of M69 incendiary bomblets, filled with a thickened, gelatinous gasoline designed to cling to wood and paper. The crews, stripped down to their flight suits in the stifling heat, feel the vibration of the four-bladed propellers beginning to bite into the humid air. As the lead planes lift off, their wheels barely clearing the jagged cliffs at the edge of the island, a grim realization settles over the men. They are flying low tonight, low enough to see the flickers of the cooking fires in the city below, low enough to smell the burning. For the Japanese pilots waiting in the dark over Tokyo, the sound of the approaching swarm is no longer a distant hum. It is the rhythmic, pulsing heartbeat of an apocalypse that will return night after night until there is nothing left to burn. The birth of the B-29 Superfortress was not merely a military necessity. It was one of the greatest industrial gambles in human history. To understand why Japanese pilots felt a sense of creeping dread as these silver silhouettes appeared on the horizon, one must understand the sheer technological chasm the United States had crossed to build them. In 1940, the U.S. Army Air Corps realized that if Great Britain fell, they would need a very long-range bomber, a machine capable of crossing oceans, carrying massive payloads, and returning home without the need for intermediate bases. The project, designated XB-29, was so ambitious that it cost $3 billion, roughly $1 billion more than the Manhattan Project that created the atomic bomb. This was the pinnacle of 1940s engineering. It featured the first fully pressurized cabin in a bomber, allowing crews to fly at altitudes of 30,000 feet without oxygen masks or heated suits. It boasted a revolutionary remote-controlled fire control system, where gunners used small periscopes and electronic computers to aim turrets located elsewhere on the fuselage. It was a flying battleship, faster than many of the world's frontline fighters and capable of delivering a payload that dwarfed anything in the Japanese or German arsenals. However, the B-29's entry into the war was anything but smooth. The Wright R-3350 duplex Cyclone engines, massive 18-cylinder power plants, were prone to overheating and catching fire. In the early stages of the campaign, more B-29s were lost to mechanical failure and engine fires than to enemy action. The Superfortress was a temperamental beast, a machine pushed into mass production before its flaws were fully ironed out. Because the pressure from Washington was absolute, Japan had to be brought to its knees from the air. Initially, the strategy was precision daylight bombing. Based in the China-Burundia Theater under Operation Matterhorn, the B-29s were tasked with flying over the Himalayas, the hump, to reach bases in China, from which they would strike Japanese steel mills and aircraft factories. But the logistics were a nightmare. Every gallon of fuel used for a mission had to be flown over the world's highest mountains. By the time the Mariana Islands, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam were captured in late 1944, the Americans finally had a stable, sea-supplied, unsinkable aircraft carrier from which to launch their final assault. Yet, even with these bases, the early missions were failures. The high-altitude winds over Japan, later discovered to be the jet stream, were so powerful, clock speeds exceeding 150 knots, that they blew bombs miles off target and forced planes to fly at ground speeds so slow they became sitting ducks for Japanese anti-aircraft fire. By January 1945, the B-29 program was on the verge of being labeled a colossal waste of resources. The precision bombing raids from the Marianas were yielding dismal results. Clouds and the relentless jet stream meant that only a fraction of the bombs dropped were hitting their intended industrial marks. The American public and the high command in Washington were growing impatient. Into this atmosphere of frustration stepped Major General Curtis LeMay. A cigar-chomping, tactical innovator known as Old Iron Pants, LeMay was not interested in the gentlemanly theories of precision bombing if they didn't work. He looked at the reconnaissance photos of Japan and saw something the theorists had missed. Japanese industry was not centralized in massive, sprawling factories like those in the Ruhr Valley of Germany. Instead, it was decentralized. Millions of small shadow factories, tiny workshops and family homes, produced the nuts, bolts, and small components that fed the larger assembly lines. These cities were built of wood, bamboo, and paper. They were the most flammable urban environments on Earth. LeMay realized that to destroy the Japanese war machine, he didn't need to hit a specific factory chimney from $30,000 feet. He needed to burn the very fabric of the city to the ground. On the night of March 9, 1945, LeMay issued a set of orders that shocked his crews. He stripped the B-29s of almost all their defensive machine guns and ammunition to save weight and increase the bomb load. He ordered them to fly not at $30,000 feet, but at a staggering $5,000 to $9,000 feet. Most importantly, he switched the mission from day to night. At low altitude, the jet stream was no longer a factor, and the Japanese night fighter force was known to be weak and disorganized. This was a radical departure from everything the Air Force had preached. It was a gamble that relied on the Japanese being utterly unprepared for a low-level, nocturnal invasion. The crews were terrified. They felt like they were being sent into a trap, flying slow and low over one of the most heavily defended cities on the planet. But LeMay knew that if the gamble paid off, the silver rain of incendiaries would change the course of the Pacific War in a single night. This transition from high-altitude precision to low-altitude firestorm was the moment the B-29 truly became the weapon the Japanese feared most, a predator that thrived in the dark. To understand the sheer psychological and physical impact of the B-29 campaign, one must look at the tactical angle, the cold, calculated evolution of the mission parameters. By March 1945, the B-29 had been stripped of its fortress identity and turned into a pure delivery system. Removing the heavy General Electric remote-controlled turrets and ammunition belts saved over $700 pounds of weight. This allowed for more fuel and, more importantly, a significantly higher density of incendiary ordnance. By flying at low altitudes, the pilots no longer struggled against the $200 mile-per-hour winds of the upper atmosphere. They could fly heavy and slow, maximizing the accuracy of their drops. This tactical shift turned the B-29 from a frustrated sniper into a methodical, industrial-scale arsonist. The technological angle focuses on the weapon that made the destruction possible, the M69 incendiary. These were not traditional bombs that exploded on impact to shatter concrete. They were sophisticated fire starters. Each cluster bomb contained 38 individual submunitions filled with napalm, thickened gasoline. Upon being dropped from the B-29, the cluster would break apart at a set altitude, trailing long streamers to stabilize their descent. When they hit the ground, a timed fuse ignited a black powder charge, shooting a jet of burning gel up to $100 feet in all directions. These fire sticks were specifically engineered to pierce the thin tile roofs of Japanese homes and ignite the dry wooden interiors. The technology was a direct response to the shadow factory economy, turning every civilian home into a potential fuel source for a massive, self-sustaining firestorm. The Japanese perspective offers a harrowing look at the B-san, Mr. B, as the Japanese civilians and pilots began to call the Superfortress. For the Japanese fighter pilots, the B-29 was a ghost that could not be caught. At high altitudes, the Japanese interceptors, like the Nakajima Ki-84 Hei or the Kawasaki Ki-61 Hien, struggled to even reach the bomber's cruising height. The air was so thin that their engines would sputter and stall, while the B-29s cruised comfortably in their pressurized, heated cabins. When the Americans switched to night raids, the terror only intensified. Japan's night fighter capabilities were primitive. They lacked effective airborne radar, meaning pilots had to rely on ground-based searchlights to illuminate the silver bellies of the B-29s. Once a pilot found a target, he often had only seconds to attack before the bomber vanished into the smoke and darkness. Finally, the leadership angle highlights the merciless pragmatism of General Curtis LeMay. To LeMay, there were no innocents in a total war where every household was producing aircraft parts. He was a commander who prioritized results over tradition, and his willingness to risk his entire fleet at low altitudes was a gamble that relied on the exhaustion of the Japanese defense. He knew the Japanese were running out of high-grade aviation fuel and experienced pilots. By returning night after night, he wasn't just destroying buildings. He was conducting a war of attrition against the Japanese psyche. The constant, thrumming roar of the R-3350 engines became a psychological weapon, a signal to the people below that their government was powerless to protect the very air above their heads. Section 4. Climax/Turning Point, Part 1. March 10th, 1945, 12:08 a.m. Over Tokyo. The air over the Japanese capital is crisp and cold, but within minutes, it will become an oven. The Pathfinders, lead B-29s, arrive first. They drop 100-pound M47 incendiaries to mark the target area, creating a massive, glowing X of fire in the densely populated Shitamachi district. Following behind them is a stream of silver giants, 300 strong, flying in a low-level combat box formation that spans miles. As the main force reaches the X, the bomb bay doors groan open, and the silence of the night is shattered by the whistling of thousands of M69 canisters. On the ground, the scene is an instantaneous descent into hell. The M69s don't just explode. They punch through roofs and spray burning napalm that sticks to skin, wood, and clothing. Within 30 minutes, the scattered fires begin to merge, fed by a stiff 28-mile-per-hour wind blowing from the north. This creates a firestorm, a meteorological phenomenon where the heat becomes so intense that it creates its own weather system. The rising pillars of superheated air suck in oxygen from the surrounding streets with the force of a hurricane, dragging people into the flames and flipping over fire trucks like toys. For the B-29 crews at 7,000 feet, the experience is visceral. The upward thermals from the burning city are so violent that they toss the 60-ton bombers around like autumn leaves. Pilots struggle with the controls as the smell of burning wood and flesh seeps into the pressurized cabins, despite the altitude. Below them, Tokyo is no longer a city. It is a shimmering, incandescent lake of fire. The Japanese searchlights, usually a symbol of defiance, are swallowed by the blinding orange glow of the horizon. The anti-aircraft fire, the flak, is erratic and desperate as the gunners on the ground are blinded by the smoke and heat of their own dying city. As the sun rises on March 10th, 16 square miles of Tokyo have been erased from the earth. More than 100,000 people have perished in a single night, a death toll higher than the immediate impact of either atomic bomb. But for the Japanese high command, the true terror is not just the destruction. It is the realization that the Americans are not stopping. The B-29s return to the Marianas, refuel, rearm, and within 48 hours, they are over Nagoya, then Osaka, then Kobe, then Yokohama. The Japanese air defense is in a state of total collapse. The legendary Zero fighters and the newer Raiden interceptors are grounded not by the enemy, but by a lack of high-octane fuel and oil. Pilots who do manage to scramble find themselves overwhelmed. The B-29s, flying at night without their heavy guns, are faster than expected and camouflaged by the black sky and the blinding glare of the fires below. The Japanese pilots feel a paralyzing sense of futility. They're flying against the Silver Death, a machine that seems to possess industrial immortality. The turning point is psychological as much as it is physical. The night after night, strategy breaks the Japanese rhythm of life. Workers cannot sleep. Factories are piles of ash, and the rail lines are severed. By May 1945, the firebombing campaign has destroyed the urban centers of 67 Japanese cities. The B-29s have transitioned from a military weapon to a force of nature. General LeMay's gamble has succeeded in burning the heart out of the empire. The Japanese leadership, once adamant about a decisive battle on the home islands, begins to watch the skies with a new kind of silence. They realize that the Americans no longer need to invade to win. They can simply continue to incinerate Japan from the safety of the clouds until there is nothing left to rule. By the summer of 1945, the physical landscape of Japan had been irrevocably altered. The statistics of the aftermath are staggering, painted in the ash of 67 cities. Over $105,000 tons of incendiaries had been dropped, resulting in the destruction of roughly $180 square miles of urban area. In Tokyo alone, the March 9th to 10th raid destroyed 1/4 of the city's buildings and left over 1 million people homeless. The shadow factories LeMay sought to destroy were gone, and with them, the last remnants of Japan's industrial capacity. Production of aircraft engines dropped by $75%, and the assembly of new airframes ground to a halt as the supply of small components, the nuts, bolts, and specialized wiring made in home workshops, vanished into the firestorms. The human cost was a demographic catastrophe. It is estimated that between $330,000 and $500,000 civilians were killed in the firebombing campaign. Millions more fled to the countryside, causing a total collapse of the urban labor force. This mass migration created a secondary crisis, a famine of unprecedented proportions. With the rail lines twisted and the ports mined by B-29s in a campaign known as Operation Starvation, the food distribution system failed. The Japanese people, once emboldened by the rhetoric of Bushido and national sacrifice, were now reduced to a state of primitive survival, scavenging for roots and grain in a country that was literally smoldering. The psychological aftermath for the Japanese military was equally devastating. The vaunted Imperial Japanese Army Air Service and Navy Air Service were effectively neutered. Pilots who had survived the slaughter of the Solomon Islands and the Philippine Sea now sat on runways, next to planes they couldn't fly, watching the B-29s pass overhead with impunity. The terror mentioned by these pilots was not just the fear of death, but the fear of irrelevance. They were the shield of the emperor, yet they were forced to watch from the ground as their history and their homes were turned to charcoal. The B-29 had achieved something rare in the history of warfare. It had broken the will of a warrior culture before the first enemy soldier had even set foot on the home islands. As the fires cooled, a new and darker shadow began to loom over the B-29 campaign. While the incendiary raids had achieved their strategic goals, they sparked a profound moral and ethical debate within the American high command that persists to this day. General Curtis LeMay himself was famously candid about the nature of the campaign, later remarking, "I suppose if I'd lost the war, I would have been tried as a war criminal." The shift from tactical targets to dehousing civilian populations blurred the lines of traditional military ethics. However, from the perspective of the Joint Chiefs, the B-29s were saving American lives. The projected casualties for Operation Downfall, the planned invasion of Japan, were estimated in the millions. The logic of the firestorms was a cold, utilitarian one. Burn the enemy into submission now to avoid a bloodbath on the beaches later. This era of the B-29 also served as the final laboratory for the atomic age. The logistics, the flight paths, and the psychological conditioning of the Japanese populace were all precursors to the missions of the Enola Gay and Boxcar. On August 6th and August 9th, 1945, the Superfortress moved from dropping thousands of bombs to dropping just one. The devastation of Hiroshima and Nagasaki was the horrific climax of a process that had begun months earlier in the wooden suburbs of Tokyo. The B B-29 had proven that air power, when applied with industrial totality, could end a war. The final missions in August 1945 were almost surreal. Even after the atomic bombs were dropped and the Emperor's dual voice broadcast announced the surrender, B-29s continued to fly, but their payloads changed. In Operation Blacklist, the silver giants that had brought fire now dropped mercy bombs, canisters filled with food, medicine, and clothing for Allied prisoners of war in camps across Japan. The transition from the instrument of death to a vessel of relief marked the closing of the most violent chapter in the history of aviation. The B-29 had not just won the war. It had fundamentally redefined the relationship between technology, civilian populations, and the state. The silver glint of a B-29 Superfortress in the Pacific sky remains one of the most polarizing images of the 20th century. To the American crews, it was a marvel of pressurized cabins and electronic marvels, a superplane that brought them home through the dark. To the Japanese pilots and civilians below, it was the B-san, an unstoppable, rhythmic force of nature that turned the night into a furnace. But beyond the tactical victories and the horrific casualty counts lies a deeper, more sobering truth about the nature of modern conflict. The B-29 campaign represented the moment humanity fully realized the industrialization of death. It was no longer a war of soldier against soldier on a distant ridge. It was a war of one nation's factory output against another nation's survival. The Superfortress proved that in the age of total war, the distance between the front line and the front porch had vanished. Today, the rusted remains of B-29s still at the islands of the Pacific, and the scars of the firestorms are woven into the foundations of modern Japanese cities. We look back on these missions not to celebrate the destruction, but to understand the terrifying weight of the responsibility that comes with such power. The Japanese pilots were right to be terrified, not just of the machine itself, but of the new world it ushered in. It was a world where a single flight crew could decide the fate of a city, and where the sky was no longer a sanctuary, but a source of inevitable mechanical judgment. As the last of the R-3350 engines faded into history, they left behind a silence that still echoes, a reminder that while technology can win a war, the cost is often etched forever into the soul of humanity.